Welcome to the Embodied Life podcast with Jake Potter. The Embodied Life podcast is brought to you by the Australian Centre for Embodied Practice, bringing the wisdom of the world's embodied and somatic practices together, intersecting deep thinking and embodied learning to restore goodness to ourselves and the world. Great. So I'd like to start, Claire, just with a little story of your relationship to being embodied when you were younger. How was it? However you can kind of contextualize that question of what did it mean to be an embodied human? I know that you work in a lot of the ecological space. So however you can contextualize, your embodiment as a young person. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as soon as I start picturing myself as a young one, it's in place. You know, I have a really strong relationship with the place I grew up. So it's like my larger body is the kind of feeling when I visualize myself as a young one. I'm outside, I'm climbing trees, I'm making cubbies in the bamboo on the riverbank, I'm trailing after my brothers across the paddocks with my Fisher-Price tracking set around my waist, looking for bear tracks and fox dens, and it's kind of a really rich memory landscape of the outdoors and rolling and tumbling with my four siblings, you know, on the grass, down the riverbanks, in the trees. And it's been only recently, since my parents have just sold the property after 45 years, that I've begun grieving the place where I grew up and how much a part of my body it is. Like I've been so informed by that landscape. Embodiment for me as a kid feels like having the privilege, I guess, to really develop those strong relationships with the landforms and the animals of that place, and to kind of interact with them on a daily basis with my body. And the smells and the sights and the kind of changing of the seasons, you know, it's over so many years of growing up there. It's like it just feels really embedded in me. Recently I went back to start the goodbyes to the land and just feeling in my body how much that place is in me, and it's like grieving a part of me. Like it'll be like a lost limb in a way. So great first question.
Yeah, I'm curious. Even just hearing you speak then, I'm reminded of your book. Both your books, you have such an intricate and subtle way of explaining the landscape in which you're in, like the colors and, you know, just the way you describe being with your brothers. And is that something that's been always a real, I guess, like, did you always have that awareness of the landscape when you were young, or is it more in a hindsight since you've developed that you've kind of got this like almost this like bodily memory of the landscape coming back, or is that something you're kind of like acutely aware of as a youngster?
Yeah, I guess it's only in hindsight. You know, I think growing up, it's just like, well, surely this is what everyone experiences. There's one moment I remember when I was 18, on the cusp of leaving home to study in the city, and it was like I was walking along the riverbank, which is kind of my place of solace as a teenager, and just I can feel it now, like this, filled with this sense of the kind of like nostalgia of leaving home, but also just like the place filling me up and sending me onwards. But I think I've always had a really nuanced like body sense of a place. Like I kind of like feel like a sponge, and I soak it in wherever I am, and it's my surroundings are really important to me. Like the beauty of a place, the way I feel in a place, the way I encounter a place. I couldn't live in a place of that didn't have a kind of aesthetic beauty to it, and a wildish quality to it, because it's just part of my spirituality as well, is how I relate to place, and the nourishment that I draw from noticing the patterns in the landscape and the changing of the seasons, and having enough kind of non-human landforms around me that I can relate to and track, and just, you know, even just every morning sitting out with a cup of tea on my deck in Melbourne and watching the weather, watching the trees relate to the weather and what's happening in the early morning, you know, that just feeds me so deeply. So I'm glad that it is translated into my writing. It's, some feedback that people give me is such a vivid description of place, like it puts them there, and that gives me joy to realize I've somehow related my experience into words. 'Cause not always easy.
Yeah, and I think this kind of raises, you know, I'm curious to know, you know, you've just spent, it's a little while ago now, maybe 5 years ago or something, you spent a year out in the wilderness. And I know for me, you know, I can go into nature for 2 or 3 days and become so differently sensitized to the subtleties of nature, and then coming back into, you know, Melbourne where we are, but any city can be so overwhelming. And I imagine being out for a year would be like incredibly overwhelming to come back to a place like this where there's cars and there's traffic lights and the whole thing. And now you're situated here. And I guess, I mean, I know that you live in a beautiful house, a rare house. You live close to the city and it's on a river. But I guess like in the urban landscape more generally, how do you kind of like find your way in someone that, you know, is so connected to the landscape and knows the richness of that? And I imagine there's maybe a loss there. But it also seems in your work that there's something also gained. There's still a way that you're finding an ecological sense of place.
Yeah, sure. It was actually 10 years ago that I spent my year in the wilds.
That was 10 years ago now.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
This year. Last year actually. But that time of returning from that experience where I really had, my focus was on the wild world. I had fairly little interest in the human world. And to have the opportunity to really sink my roots into a wild landscape, and see what happened to me, see what happened to my psyche, what was evoked when I took myself as far as I could out of the city mind, was the experiment that I really wanted to have out there. But integrating was really difficult, and I wasn't expecting it to be so hard. I didn't come straight back to the city, but pretty much when I landed in Melbourne, I was living in Brunswick in the concrete suburbs. And it literally was a bit of a shock to the system. And as you said, I've found a beautiful place that kind of has a wildish quality while being in the city. And I think what I'm still discovering is the beauty of having a smaller kind of area, like a smaller area in a way, and kind of less diversity, because there is less diversity in a city area. It almost kind of amplifies the attention in a way, because the attention is focused on a backyard or a park area or a particular walk that I take every day. And the diversity of plants and animals are fewer. So in a way, you can develop, and I've found you can develop like deeper relationships, or the relationships are more valued because they're rare. You know, it's like the powerful owl that calls most nights still around my neighbourhood, because it's occupying the big hollows of the River Red Gums along the Yarra. If I heard that out in a wilderness area, it'd be cool, and it is, but it's like in the context of like, well, yeah, this is your realm. But when I hear it in the city, and when I saw, you know, I've seen a wallaby a couple of times in my backyard, including once a couple of weeks ago. I was literally just having a cup of tea on the back veranda, and I heard a kind of a rustle that, it was interesting now I look back on it. It was a rustle that I knew was not cat. I knew it was not bird or snake or reptile. Like, it had the kind of weight. I knew it was a wallaby, and my attention immediately went to the little like corridor of green between the neighbours and my house. And there it was, this wallaby pretty much almost on Heidelberg Road. So if I saw a wallaby in the bush, it'd just be like, oh yeah, there's the wallaby. But there's something about the rarity of these creatures in the city that that almost gives me more of a sense of their presence, and I value them more. So the kind of scarcity factor then ups the significance in a way. Same with when I find bush food in the city, or it's almost like the containment of the wildish areas almost makes it more accessible. It's not overwhelming. It's not just like this kind of like wall of green. It's like you can more easily start to kind of track the patterns in the landscape. And and I've been lucky to land myself in an area where there's wild green corridors and a river, and it's like there's enough in terms of a ratio. There's enough wildness for me here to feed me, which is really wonderful to find out that I can live in the city and feel full of wildish quality.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and it actually reminds me of a piece that I read in your book a little while ago, and about this, like, I guess, like, in hearing you say that there's a sense of finding yourself in the landscape. I think, like, one thing I really noticed from your work is this paradox between finding oneself internally by finding the external environment. And I guess, like, in a world that is largely fixated on us and humanness, but also in the world of self-development and looking inwards, there's some beautiful paradox in your work of looking outwards and finding some self within by looking out. And just hearing you talk about the wallabies and stuff, it just reminded me of this piece in here where you talk about birds and you talk about tracking. And you say, day by day, I am colouring in the spaces between and beyond, trying to connect the dots into a coherent whole, make the landscape familiar and known. It's a way of befriending the land, building relationships and assigning meaning. I like to think I'm mapping the story of the land, but it's much my story that I reference, my impressions, my tracks, my landmarks. I map the land as much to know myself as to know it. And then you go on and talk about bird song and listening to the birds and having this sense of the birds allowing you to find yourself in the landscape. And I guess I was just reminded of that, of hearing you speak about, seeing the wallaby and somehow that reminding you of your place and reminding you of who you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, there's one thing about learning tracking in terms of like, animal footprints in the sand, but holistic tracking, which is something I like to think of myself as a holistic tracker. My time in nature when I'm tracking the landscape is as much about tracking my own inner workings. What's everything that's happening inside of me and outside of me. So in a way, it's like a dynamic meditation or like an expanded mindfulness practice, especially birds. Especially bird language.
What is it about birds? Because I notice you talk about birds a lot. There's something special. And I guess it's hard to grasp when you're just hearing about, bird songs. Like how does birds relate to self in song and in rhythm? And
well, I mean, in so many, birds are such a love for myself, and I just have to head after this. I head home to run a bird language webinar. I mean, just on a simple level, I was once taught that tuning into bird language is the doorway to a quiet mind, and it sounded great in theory, but I found it to be absolutely true. And it's that sense of the birds are so charismatic. They're charismatic and they're visible, unlike most other creatures in the forest or in the landscape. Like there's foxes and snakes and wallabies all over the place in the city, but birds are what we can see, and they're really vocal and their body language is really demonstrative, and they tell us what's happening. Like there's raptors, there's all sorts of territorial skirmishes going on. Like there's layers and layers and layers at which we can know the landscape through the birds. But it's a matter of tuning in. And for me, it's just such a joy to have the curiosity to kind of know what's going on. Like I want to know what birds are passing through my backyard in the different seasons. So I take notice rather than them just kind of being this backdrop. I'm really curious. So my awareness is going out across the landscape. Like, where are the ravens coming from? Which direction are they coming from? When are the gangs and the black cockatoos along the Yarra, and when do they disappear? What's the grey fantail up to? And it takes my awareness outside of my head and it extends it like in concentric rings across the landscape. And just that deep listening, just that sense of deep listening and curiosity, I find slips me into a quiet mind, because it is like a dynamic kind of mindfulness practice in a way. I'm really focused, I'm really listening, and I'm really curious. And it does kind of embed me in a sense of putting me in place. I put myself in place, like I'm a participant in the landscape. I think one of the qualities I find so hard about kind of modern culture is the transience. The flying from here to there and moving from here to there, and I'm guilty of that too. And that sense of dislocation, like, I could put myself anywhere and expect myself to be the same person, but there's such a deeper sense of my beingness, my presence, that comes when I actually really root in place. When my sense of belonging is not just about what I'm doing in my human world, but that it's connected to my food systems and my water collection and just the relationships in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, I guess when I read A Year Without Matches, there's a good lesson in there for me, because I used to live behind the Darebin Parklands, which is a place that you speak about a lot in your new book, Rewilding the Urban Soul. And I lived behind there during the pandemic, and we were still in a pandemic, but when I was in Melbourne in a hardcore lockdown, and for such a long time that was in my 5K radius, and I went through those parklands on a daily basis. And like a sort of sit spot, it became my sort of sit walk, it was like my walk spot, and would really notice. But I got to this point at the end of the pandemic where I was like, I feel like I can't even go to the parklands anymore, like I felt like I'd walked that trail so many times. I knew it so well that it became boring to me. And as I was reading your book, and just the value in sitting in one place day after day for years, and like noticing the details. I know someone says, God is in the details. And I feel like I kind of tripped up on that in some sense, like I forgot to really pay attention, because those parklands, I feel like there's millions of things that I'm not seeing. But like that sense of transientness, and just, I guess, like glossing over life and just seeing the surface and not waiting long enough to see those tiny changes and the magnificence in that, and the finding of self in that, and what that means to be a part of that place. Yeah, I guess it was like a really good lesson that I got from your book, of being so done with a certain piece of land that is actually so rich, and there's probably so many things that I have never seen before which are worth my attention.
No doubt. I mean, I know that my sit spot on the river almost barely begun to scratch the surface. I mean, it's like a relationship. An intimate relationship. You can get to a point like, I know everything about you, and suddenly you're not seeing the other person fresh every day. Like, this person's a new person every day. I don't want to assume anything about this person. Same with a sit spot or a place in nature. Like, there's so many layers of understanding that you could take a lifetime to really uncover. I was talking to one kind of urban tracker the other day. He came to do a vision quest with me, and he was sharing his story of his backyard, which is in a kind of outer city suburb, and he's been taking photos every day of a family of praying mantis, just as they had babies. And it's like, it's incredible to me that he was tracking this one family of praying mantis in his backyard, and how much joy that gave him. And the level of detail that this man sees, he could spend a couple of hours with one flower. That kind of detail astounds me and inspires me.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to take a step in another direction, I think, as I was reading A Year Without Matches, there was also something I guess that I noticed a lot more in the first half of the book. And there was this real sense of, as you were diving into the landscape, memories of things were emerging for you. I know there was some like really significant memories of your grandma and being at her house, and it just like, I guess I noticed this being embedded in place and location in an environment led to certain memories to arise that were like really meaningful, and had a lot of weight. And I guess like, I don't know if you've got anything to say about that, or if that was something that you noticed, if that was something that I just sort of interpreted from your writing, was this relationship by diving into it one place. And then I guess like also like we were talking about before, this paradox of finding oneself. It felt like there was memories that were significant that could have like only have happened in that place. And that maybe there was like, I guess like a sensory nature that I noticed of the place, which brought out like the sensory memories of things in your past, which were very much a part of then like how you're emerging as a person in that time.
Yep, great question. I would say that kind of experience is more about the context that I was in rather than the actual place. I could have probably put myself in any place of wild nature at that time in my life, and I would be having such rich kind of experience of like diving into my inner world, because the way I understand that period in my life is it was part of and really central to a kind of initiatory phase of my development. And as I understand it in my work, I really understand the role that being in places of wild nature plays in human development. Like there's something, especially at a certain point in life, where you're really starting to ask the bigger questions like, who am I? What am I really here for? And these old identities are falling away, and this sense of kind of like a dying of the self. They're the times where going into an extended period, even if it's a matter of days in wild nature alone, expedites the process of that kind of dive into the inner realm of the psyche. There's a reciprocal relationship between wild nature and the wilds of soul, as I understand it. And my experience is, unless someone has a kind of time in their life where they have that experience of kind of being eco-awakened, of really knowing themselves as part of a greater web of life, of really not just in a kind of intellectual sense, but a really embodied sense of myself is part of this much larger body. And then that precipitates a kind of initiatory experience, which is what I started to have out there, where old memories were surfacing, really rich dream world, and kind of like a descent into the underworld in that type of language, which is really about looking at my purpose. What am I here for? And not in a kind of way that I was just reflecting on it, but wild nature was reflecting back to me, mirroring back to me who I really was in a way that I couldn't have got in a therapist's office or journaling at home within four walls. It's something that can really only happen in a place of wild nature.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so beautiful. This idea of eco-awakened. I love that. And I guess like to kind of go more into that, like what is that, like I guess in the context of being embodied and in the context of, I guess like, becoming who you are and finding your path and like really finding who you are, this idea of being eco-awakened, like what is it about place, or what is it about the landscape that maybe is a point of differentiation, like compared to the therapy room or compared to a yoga class or compared to, a self-development workshop? Like what is it about place, do you think?
It's a great question. Like why do we need to spend time in nature for our growth? Why can't we just exist in a human world? Why can't we do all the personal work we need within a therapist's office? I don't really believe we can. I think there's things we can only do in like the relational sphere with other humans. But I really feel like there's parts of our wholeness that we only really find when we're mirrored back by the more than human world, and certainly one of those parts, which is one of the parts most suppressed in this kind of consumer culture, is the wild archetype, the wild indigenous self, the part of us that absolutely knows their belonging to the earth, that doesn't doubt their inherent connectedness. But greater than that, this wild self is totally at home in their own emotions. Emotions are just another experience to be moved through, and that wild self almost kind of welcomes in the grief and the joy and the anger and the fear. It's all part of that experience of being at home in the body, at home in the emotional body, at home in the world. And the language of soul, as I know it and as I've experienced it, is not going to come to us through words. Soul doesn't speak through words. It speaks in image. Dream image is one example. It speaks in metaphor and in sign and symbol and omen and intuition and hunches. It's just not going to speak to us through words. It comes through that immersion in a language older than words. These are some of the reasons why I feel like a depth of connection with nature and periods of immersion in nature, not necessarily to live, but to dive in. It's almost like learning a language, becoming literate in the language of soul and how soul is connected with nature, nature and psyche. And then you can come back to the city and that conversation can keep going. Then it's available. But sometimes it takes those periods of immersion in a wilder place to really let that conversation happen, to kind of break through the rational linear mind. So many people that I take on these wilderness rites of passage, what they're mostly trying to kind of break through is this linear way of thinking, this, rational, goal-oriented, trying, doing state, some might call the masculine archetype. And trying to find and cultivate their creativity, their receptivity, their sensitivity, their emotionality. And times in nature are really powerful for that.
Yeah. And I guess I can resonate with that of learning how to do that. It's a different language. It needs practice. Like in hearing you say, soul speaks in these ways. We don't get taught to speak in these ways, That is not a way in which we learn. And I guess as I think about it now, to think symbolically and through image, but all through the sensing body that's even pre-symbolic or pre-cognition, to learn these ways takes a lot of practice and is not something that, is often talked about at all.
Yeah. And that's why practices like dance or nature observation and awareness, especially when it's has that sense of, rather than the scientific mind, it's more of a sense of wandering and letting the land be animate again, opening to that sense of the sentient animate world. Yeah. It is learning a language that we've forgotten. Yeah. And at first it can just seem like fantasy or clunky or, but with some practice and with some intention, it just comes back because it's innate, it's inherent. Our ancestors lived that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful little excerpt that I took out of Rewilding the Urban Soul. And it's this idea of, I think it came from someone, I'm not quite sure, but this idea of creation mind or wild mind that you write about. And I guess it's kind of similar, it sounds like, to what we're speaking right now. And I just loved what you wrote about it. And you said, creation mind is characterized by present moment focus, sensory expansion, full-bodied engagement with the world, a deep participation in the inner and outer landscape simultaneously. And that feels beautiful. That is just a beautiful sentiment of not only being in nature, but just being in the world in general. And I guess I love this idea of sensory expansion. It's I guess one question that I'm always interested in is someone who thinks about these things a lot. and I guess you would have your own sort of view on this because of your place-based work and what you know to be meaningful in your life, is like, where do we begin and end? Like, how would you answer that question? Like, we've obviously got the outside of our skin, but to say that we are one of the greater body of the earth, I don't know if you've got something to say about that, but like, where do we begin and where do we end? Our sense of self, our sense of who we are in the world. Do you see that as being sort of confined to the skin and then in relationship to an outer environment, or does it somehow extend on? Just curious to know how you'd think about that.
Yeah, where do we begin and end? I mean, it's a good question in this kind of exploration of like a sense of embeddedness in the landscape. Because what I'm trying to cultivate both for myself but also for others is an expanded state of sense of self. So the sense of self is not just, I think it's Alan Watts called it like the skin encapsulated ego. That's a really contracted state to be in, when my sense of self is just what's within this skin and this kind of like physical mind dominated experience. This discursive mind is my experience of the world, but it's so limited. It's just one of the intelligences that we have available to us. But when we can start to expand our senses, and it sounds simplistic, but really one of the most powerful survival skills, not just survival skills, but skills of belonging, really, is learning a different way to kind of soak in or be in any landscape, be it city or wild. And that really is a sense of like listening, deep listening in the four directions. Like, what's the quietest sound I can hear? How does it feel to walk on this landscape? What's the felt sense of it? Just that simple thing of like really opening to the experience of the land. There's just such a relax, like such an expansion, such a kind of like, I don't have to kind of keep myself inside here or contracted. I had one experience though, which reminded me to be kind of slow in this exploration. Though I was doing some one-on-one mentoring with someone, and she was practicing this out in a park, and then got on the train to go home and kind of was overwhelmed by overstimulation, kind of got nauseous. It's like, oh yeah, you need to kind of dial the radar down a bit as well, because it can be too much in the city. But that's where this kind of crossover between the sensory expansion and the nature observation. So there's like a tracking of what's going on in the landscape, both inner and outer. And that creation mind, yeah, I love that concept of creation mind. One of my mentors, John Young, talked about creation mind in relationship to the experience he had hanging out with the Sounds Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, and how they're just always in creation mind, just that kind of like original mind, just like present-centered in their bodies, expanded awareness. And I was complaining to him about, I just can't be in creation mind in the city, and that sense of I'm too busy and I'm just kind of locked in my to-do list. And he was just really unequivocal. He just said, look, Claire, no, creation mind's available to you anytime. It's not about where you are. And while it's quite an extension to think about being in creation mind while writing emails, yeah, just the experiment of like relaxing into our kind of full-bodied awareness of wherever we are.
Yeah. It's I guess it kind of brings us to, I guess, like where your work is right now, and I guess what you articulate in Rewilding the Urban Soul is, you did a year out in the bush, sort of finding your way in place, and then now you've sort of transitioned to being in the urban environment. And you mentioned in there, like, that's kind of really where the work is. And I could feel the realness in that because, it seems like we're not going to sort of go back to a primitive way of living. Like, there's just like no chance that the whole world is going to go back to some tribal way and just live without matches for the next, 2,000 years. It's just not going to happen. And so I guess our task is like, how do we, I know Stephen Jenkinson says like wisdom is place-based. Like we need to know where we're situated, and then wisdom comes from knowing where we are at a certain point of history. And so wisdom changes over time depending on where we are. And I think the work that you're doing is wise in the sense of like we are in this place. You and I are in Melbourne, but for the most of the Western world, they're in cities and urban environments. And so I guess I'd just love to open up that conversation of how does one rewild their soul in the urban environment. I think is something that seems realistic in terms of how we're living, but is also a challenge because of the nature of the urban environment and what extends beyond that. So I'd just love to know, like, I guess, like, where could we start in that conversation? Like, what feels like a good beginning place to speak about rewilding the urban soul?
Rewilding the urban soul. I mean, I love that word rewilding. When I discovered it, when I read it, it was after I did my year in the bush, and it was like, oh, that's what I've been doing. I've been rewilding, just this sense of bringing the wild back, not just as a place, but as a quality, a kind of quality of awareness, a quality of aliveness. And the movement, the human rewilding movement, is really firmly not about the back to the land movement, which was kind of the solution in the 70s that people were, experimenting with. Oh, we've got to leave the city and form these intentional communities out in rural areas. Well, no, rewilding is actually saying we need to do it wherever we are. And we can do it in the city. And really it's about, at its core, is really about bringing back a sense of wild awareness. This sense of the sovereign self-willed, like self-willed is one of the meanings of wild, where it comes from. This sense of like bringing back our inherent, reclaiming our inherent sense of belonging to place, to self, to purpose, reclaiming in a kind of aliveness.
For instance, say, I'm living in
you
city.
Want details.
Yeah, I guess I guess I'm really like seriously curious, I can see how it'd be really easy in the bush, but like say for example, you live in an apartment, 4 stories up, you got a little balcony, you live in Melbourne City, or you live in San Francisco, or you're in London or something. How does one start to go about doing that? Wild awareness in a space that's really unwild.
Yeah. Well, I'll give a kind of like an inner and an outer practice, I guess. One way is to find a sit spot, find a place that does have a wildish quality to it. And it can be an urban park, somewhere where it feels like you're just out of the kind of human gaze, and really start to track that landscape. Just because even just the act of sitting still in a wildish place with your phone turned off, that in itself evokes a kind of a rhythm that's really outside the kind of beta brain, the modern mind. And then finding other people to kind of share that experience with would be the next level, like actually starting to develop a kind of a literacy of place. But on the inner landscape, I would say like really paying attention to the dreamscape, really starting to pay attention to the subtler voices of soul, having time where technology's off, and engaging in a kind of wandering practice, whether that's wandering in your neighborhood, wandering around the city, wherever you are. But that sense of there's one powerful practice for wandering, which is imagine that everything around you is as interested and curious in you as you are in it. Like developing that, practicing that muscle, or exercising that kind of deep imagination of everything being a bit alive and sentient and animate, which you can do anywhere. And really opening to that language of soul, like where am I wandering? Where am I ending up? What am I passing? What's taking my attention? I guess it's like opening that doorway to the conversational nature of things, as David White calls it, that opening to those synchronistic kind of encounters. That in itself is a really powerful practice for rewilding the psyche. But yeah, it's a challenge in the city. It is a challenge, but there are ways. There are ways.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and it reminds me, of David Abram's work, largely based on philosopher Merleau-Ponty and the intersubjectivity that we're in at all times. And I guess that idea that, as we're touching something, we're also being touched. And I guess it's easy to forget that. It's hard to, remember that as we move into the world, there's a conversation coming back in the intersubjectivity of who we are, both with our fellow humans and with, the animals and the plants, but also with buildings. And, even to think about the room we're sitting in now is looking at us. And I guess as I sense that, like, my responsibility of acting in a certain way kind of changes. Like, how am I going to relate to this world? How am I going to be in this world? Yeah, in a way that is a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I've had students of mine who were coming to the Rewild Friday programs over a couple of years, coming with almost zero ecological knowledge, just some knowing that nature was a missing piece of their life.
Mm.
And some of them developed a sit spot practice, and they had some really significant relationships with trees in just urban parklands. They were their teachers.
Yeah.
Those trees taught them a lot. And they found themselves connecting to the trees in a way that surprised them. Even like one woman had a simple act of just pouring some of her coffee that she'd sit there with every morning before work, just pouring a little bit of coffee at the base of the trunk of the tree as a thanksgiving. Even that small practice really opened her heart. Yeah. So one kind of experiment that I ran in the last couple of years before lockdown was a program called Rewild Fridays, which was an invitation to join a group of people in an urban parkland every Friday and practice the skills of deep nature connection and rewilding and ancestral skills, living skills. And I didn't know how it would go. I've only ever really practiced those skills consistently when I'm outside the city. And what I found was that these people had, especially if they were coming regularly over a couple of years, had really profound experiences of healing, like personal healing, trauma healing, but also kind of moving forward in their kind of spiritual development in a way that they weren't expecting, I wasn't expecting. And a lot of them developed a sit spot practice at home. But we'd come together, we'd learn how to make fires, we'd practice all the skills of, like fibers and basket making and wild edibles and medicinals, lots of crafting with the hands, and also lots of wandering, lots of kind of nature observation and holistic tracking, all the things, and developing relationships with each other over time and having solo time. So it was kind of a phone off Friday. And what I noticed started happening really fairly quickly in the program was people developing much stronger connections with self and their place of belonging and each other. Like the community grew strong, and there's just something about that magical trifecta of connection to earth, self, and other. And these people started to make big life changes, quitting jobs that no longer serve them or relationships, starting new projects, dedicating their life to, kind of earth regeneration or regenerative cultural projects. Their vision kind of came alive in that container of a regular group practicing deep nature connection. It's deeply healing, and I found that it didn't need to be out in wild nature. Sometimes we'd have the Eastern Freeway kind of like whizzing right past us, and we'd be there making our wild salad and climbing trees and, being like kids and doing our sit spot. And it almost didn't matter where we were. There was enough wildness that we were going on a journey together, and it didn't matter where we were. In fact, it was almost through the juxtaposition of being in the city that made it more powerful. And those stories really touched me. And what I started to notice too was that they started to be drawn to more initiatory experiences like rites of passage programs, vision fasts, the more extended times in nature where where the psyche starts really speaking in that language of their soul, mirroring back something of their essence. But they needed to have that experience of kind of reconnection first. It's like a precursor, I find. It's like that kind of eco-awakening that we were touching on before. Eco-awakening as a prerequisite to any kind of full adulthood in culture. It's like unless you really feel yourself part of a larger body of life beyond the human, you can't really take your place as a full adult. It's a foundational piece, and it's a foundational piece that we're missing. So, yeah, these skills of deep nature connection, they're really simple and they're really efficient if practiced in a group. And I think it's that community setting that makes it so powerful.
Yeah, and it makes me think of this beautiful idea of community of care and relationship. I kind of get the sense that after doing things like this and, just in a solo way, in your own accord, not with anyone, is like this sense of relationship with the animate world, which of course we're embedded in, but is easy to forget when we're out here driving down High Street or... it kind of feels hard to imagine that we would be doing the things that we would be doing. And this beautiful thing of having a relationship, like beginning a relationship, a conversation. And it also makes me, think about David Abrams again, who, is like, how can we change our language? I know that a big part of his work is like, when you're sitting by a river, don't talk about the river like, oh, this is the river flowing. Like, speak to the river, like, hello, river, as if it's a living entity. And I kind of feel like your work really doing that, developing a relationship of a certain witness.
Yeah. Interesting that you should bring the river into it, because one of the adventures I went on as part of this kind of exploration was a very simple pilgrimage, but it felt like a pilgrimage from my backyard on the river and overnight into the city. So kayaking into the CBD. There was 5 of us and we camped on the banks of the river in just a public park overnight and ended up in the city the next day. So a trip that usually would take 20 minutes by car took us 2 days by river. And there was a real sense of like encountering the river as a kind of being in itself, like encountering the river's own agency. And there's something for me about spending the night camped on the edge of the river. And there was this sound of this like trickling little stream, even though it was in a stormwater channel, but it would have been a creek at one point, and it wasn't on the map. We don't know what the name of it was, if it ever had a name. But that sense of just like encountering the river over a 24-hour period and really like apprenticing like to the changing nature of being on the river, I really kind of felt its agency. And it's a beautiful practice that David Abrams suggests of almost like praising or like greeting the wild landscape as if it's a person you're meeting. And sometimes I invite that in students, like go out there and talk to the land as if you're kind of meeting people or meeting friends. There's a conversation to be had there. There's a reciprocity there. And when I was trying to track the powerful owls on the river, like where they're roosting, where they're nesting, and I finally one morning when I was on my paddleboard found the powerful owl in an elm tree just upriver from me. It wasn't even a conscious thought. It was just like I just started talking to the owl, like exclaiming, and oh my God, I found you, and look at you, and you're so beautiful, and oh my God, there's a second one of you, and look at your feathers. And it was just like this person that I'd been trying to find for months, and suddenly it's there, and the excitement just bubbled over. And it was a moment where I really felt the owl's attention, like our eyes were locked. And we started kind of doing this like neck dance with each other. I was kind of mirroring the owl as it felt like it was kind of greeting me, or there was definitely something in my outward expression of greeting that initiated some response. And yeah, it was a beautiful kind of conversation we had.
Yeah. Yeah, and the implications, I mean, I can just feel it sitting here with you, like the aliveness that I can feel in you just expressing the relationship with an owl, even for a short moment in time. There's something about your embodiment as you sit right here that feels alive and that feels really real. Like it's just like there's this.
Well, I was right back there. I was on like in the moment on the paddleboard, seeing the owl for the first time, and like the aliveness in my body still really here with me, easy to access.
Yeah. And I'm also curious about this idea of, of knowledge of the landscape from a sort of, I guess, more of an objective standpoint. Like I can imagine sort of going to the landscape and really becoming sensorily aware in the landscape, and I guess like feeling my way through, and that probably having, such value. But you're also someone who really understands plants, birds, like who they are, how they operate, just like the whole thing, the way rivers move, from a place that you've obviously read a bunch. Would you also sort of advise people to incorporate that as a practice of going away and learning about the biology of things and the names of things and the value or the importance of that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm no ecologist and no botanist at all. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge. I couldn't tell you everything that's going on in my backyard at all. But the joy for me is in the discovery, is in the journey itself of learning. And it's empowering. It's essentially really empowering to have a baseline knowledge of the landscape. I give some of my students this tourist test sometimes. It's like a questionnaire in a way that asks questions like, what's the first bird of the morning in your area? What's the nearest edible plant, non-cultivated edible plant at your back door? What phase is the moon in right now? What are 5 mammals that hunt and forage within 200 meters of your home? Some really basic kind of ecological literacy. And it's really confronting sometimes, like, where's the water come from when you turn on the tap, and where does it go to when it goes down the drain? Things like that make you realize, how connected am I to my life support systems? And what it's hopefully meant to do, this tourist test, is to kind of incite some motivation and curiosity to like, actually, I really need to know these things. Like it's really empowering. It's kind of their skills of self-reliance and awareness, just to be able to go out the back door and pick 5 plants that you can put on your sandwich at lunchtime and that are healthy and free, and they become plant allies. Or just to know what the first bird of the morning is or the last bird of the evening. Just some simple ecological awareness that totally embeds you in place. Like it's a technology of belonging. And I love field guides. Having my kind of field guides there on my bookshelf that I can consult. It's like little mysteries that I love solving, and I consistently find it really empowering to keep learning.
Yeah, and I guess in a world of consumerism and in a world of curating our lives around needing to feel safe, which I think is a really important thing to be doing. But I guess like having enough money to have a mortgage and being able to buy food and all of these things that I guess like we spend the majority of our lives thinking about and moving towards and trying to establish. I imagine there's some deep sense of safety knowing that, you could walk out at your backyard, even in the city, and feed yourself, or get shelter, or make a fire, or, stay warm. All these really primary things seems like a huge weight off the shoulders. Like, I don't know how to do that, but I'm keen to learn now, in the sense of like, if everything turned sour one day, there would be sustenance there for me, and there would be things that would keep me fed, hydrated, and warm.
Dry, warm. Yeah, for me, it's less about preparing for the apocalypse and more about just a sense of empowered self-reliance. There was experiment that my friend Taj and I did, and during the lifting of the first lockdown, there was a little period of freedom, and we decided to try and feed ourselves solely from what we could grow or forage or kind of barter from grown or foraged food for a week. And it was really powerful. Like it was so powerful to both connect me to community, because people were offering their homegrown produce and we were bartering eggs and whatnot for it. But the walk that I often go on in the mornings, suddenly I was discovering food that I hadn't seen before, because I had that eye for like, well, I need to eat today. And suddenly I'm discovering some edible berries and a whole bunch of like fresh young dock leaves and currajong seeds and like wild artichokes growing. Like all these things sprung out at me through that need. And, friend bringing over snails from his backyard to eat, and just all these, it just felt fantastic that, I didn't really go hungry for the whole week. It's incredibly empowering. And they are skills that all our ancestors for thousands of years would have known how to feed themselves from the land, what direction the weather comes in from, how to build a shelter, where to procure water. Yeah, it's a joy to kind of exercise those skills. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess as a point of sort of coming to a close, like where, including the work that you do, but I guess like the work that you do has implications on then how we generate power. We live in a world that is very much destroying the earth, except for maybe a small handful of people out there doing wonderful things and living in really ethical ways. I guess I'm like, through your work, like what would you love to see? Like what would be, if you woke up in 50 years and you were like, oh yeah, that worked. Like I'm happy it went that way. If that was the case, like how would you like to see the embodiment of the world or of this place going?
Great question. And it's a question I often ask myself, like, why am I really doing this? It's not so people can, have a cool party trick and spin fire, or, be able to kind of make a water filter if the apocalypse hits. Of course, that's, these skills are all doorways into a much deeper project that I'm passionate about, which is helping people fall in love with the earth again. Really helping people remember their deep interconnectedness. And from that place of deep love for the earth, then comes the kind of visions of cultural renaissance. So if I've planted seeds for, agents of cultural regeneration, if people have the experience that initiates their own visions, that wakes up their connectivity system, that wakes up their longings for a deeper engagement with the world. That currency of longing is such a part of this work, because you can think you're just coming along to a workshop to learn some cool nature skills, but actually what starts happening is the longing is evoked, the longing for deep engagement in the world, because one of our core needs is to serve with our gifts, is to give ourselves to the world fully. And if people wake that up in themselves, if they find what they truly want to do and how they can do it, then that's when we're really going to see culture shift to something that's life affirming. So this is currently my way of really waking up hearts in love with the world again.